Hello and welcome to Unacademy. As part of your NCERT Fundamentals, today we'll be discussing a very interesting topic out of modern India. So based on the 8th class and 12th class part 3 of NCERTs, we'll be discussing establishment of Company Raj. Now in this, we will discuss the nature of the East India Company. We will try to understand what led to trade into India, the concept of charter, and thereafter how Plassey, and because we are following what the NCERT is following, from Plassey to Mysore to Marathas, and we'll try to understand certain interesting portions which are given in the NCERTs. Now, before we begin, a very important announcement for you that the 15-month subscription at 24,999 is going to end very soon. So you should subscribe to it if you have ever considered Unacademy as a partner in your preparation. Now, the 8th class NCERT has a specific chapter called From Trade to Territories, the Company Establishes Power. However, we can add to it class 12th part 3, which is also dealing with modern India, and we get a very good combination of chapters to understand a very fundamental understanding which comes in the examination also. Just because a lot of students ask me this, please do understand one thing. 6th and 12th part 1 is ancient India. 7th and 12th class part 2 is medieval India, and 8th plus 12th class part 3 is modern India. And if you want to read, for example, world history, a little bit of chapters from 9th and 11th would help you, but the idea is that these 6 are considered fundamental NCERTs for history. This can give you a very good foundational understanding, but the question level are either within the same zone or above it, but in mains this will help you to write very good answers. So with this, let's enter the first understanding which is embedded within this chapter, which is the company and the charter. Now what the problem with the NCERT is, it is not giving you a lot of backstory. It starts in between. I'll try to fill in those gaps and try to give you a coherent story which is well structured. So when it says the company and the charter, it is asking about, or it is telling us about East India Company, the charter, and what was there a need to give a charter to the East India Company. Now to understand that, we need to understand that the Portuguese and the Dutch had already come to India, which is that from 1498, and the Dutch from 1602, they were already in India and both were important trading partners of the local rulers. Now the Portuguese though had a very big advantage, 100 years between 1500 to 1600, no other colonial power. But as I've discussed in multiple forums, which is that they had a very flawed model of colonialism which was based on creating nodes along the Indian subcontinent, controlling the seas, which is never possible. So rather having a territorial model, they had a sea-based model. The Blue Waters policy, Almeida and the Carta system was never going to work. The Dutch, when they come to India, they come with an intention to displace the Portuguese. They will do that, but they will get seduced and enticed by Indonesia, and they will thereafter go for Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, and therefore the Portuguese though did not have a very strong presence, but they remain unchallenged, and India remained open for colonialism even after the Portuguese and the Dutch were the first and second to come. So it is here that the third country to come to India was the English, fourth is Danes, and fifth is French. This is based on their date of establishment of colonies. Please do understand this point. There are two different dates which are there: Portuguese, Dutch, English, Danes, French, and the other one is Portuguese, English, Dutch, Danes, French. This is based on the first establishment of the factories. This is based on when their East India companies were established. Please do note this, because both are different, because the East India Company of the English was established first, but it came late. Dutch was established later, but was the first to arrive in India. By 1605, their presence was properly there, but the English will come only and establish a factory under Jahangir's Farman in 1613. That is the major difference. Other than that, the other remain the same. Now, as I said, because it came as a third country, why was there a delay is a very important question that explains most of the discussion also. And why was there a need for a chapter? I have an excerpt here also which explains most of it, but I would like to discuss it with you. When we talk about the East India Company, unlike the Portuguese, the Dutch, or even the Danes and the French, East India Company was not a public company, was not a state sponsored company, it was a joint stock company. And being a joint stock company, basically what it was that the initial capital, the venture capital or whatever you want to call it, the initial money which was needed to establish the East India Company did not come from the crown, where actually the British crown was very lethargic and very slow to realize the importance of the Indian sector in the East Indies. Rather, the private merchants come together and create a joint stock company, which is basically based on the initial capital coming from stocks which were floated in the London Stock Exchange, and therefore it was a private company with different people and different shareholders getting a concept of dividend. And with dividend coming into the picture, they were quite answerable. So the shareholders established or in a way nominated the court of directors, and the court of directors used to take whatever decisions had to be taken for the East India Company. This had a lot of advantage over how the Portuguese and the Dutch used to operate. Firstly, Portuguese and Dutch officials were much more egotistic. They were not appeasing. What they used to do was that they thought that they were representing the crown, so they did not really appease the rulers. On the other hand, East India Company, the joint stock company, private company, always looking for profit. Because it has a profit orientation, the problem was that they cannot just remain as a power in India. They have to make sure that they generate profit. This is where the Portuguese and the Dutch were not aggressive enough as the East India Company, and therefore East India Company was taking quicker decisions, was much more appeasing, was based on wait and watch, was trying to get as many concessions as possible, and it was more patient. This is a very important point you need to understand. It was more patient in waiting for things to go wrong in the Indian subcontinent and thereafter becoming aggressive. And thereafter their colonialism was based on a policy of wait, hands off, as it was called by Robert Clive, that you just wait for the Mysorean sector to go into decline or the Marathas to come to us. Unlike the Portuguese and Dutch, who really did not care about anything. They knew that if they did not generate profit, they are not answerable to the people. The crown will send the money for the salaries, but here the nature mattered. Now, though it is a joint stock company, the question is, there would be therefore private competition from Britain. See, because the Portuguese and the Dutch crown had established these companies, there was no way that the Portuguese and the Dutch would allow other private companies to compete with a public company or a crown sponsored company. But that is not true for the East India Company. Because the East India Company is a joint stock company, it is just like, for example, Tata or Mahindra, and therefore Tata and Mahindra can therefore compete over tenders if it is happening in Africa from the Indian side. Therefore, in order to eliminate this, the East India Company, once established in 1600, moved to the crown to say that we have not asked you for money, we have not asked you for anything, just give us at least a charter which makes us the exclusive British company to operate east of Cape of Good Hope or in the East Indies. A lot of students don't understand this point, that Charter Act could not have stopped the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French or the Danes, because it is not an international decree. It is an order which has been given within Britain so that no one else from Britain can actually operate in the Indian Ocean. It was to remove any form of rivalry from within, because that would have hurt the English interest. And the idea is very simple. Because the Portuguese, Dutch and the Danes are already floating in this sector, the East India Company needed something like this so that they were not fighting with the countries and also within themselves. So it should not be intra and inter, rather just inter-imperialistic rivalry rather than fighting amongst themselves in that regard. This is where this excerpt from the NCERT becomes important, because this tells us a very interesting story. It talks why and how the East India Company needed a charter. That royal charter was needed because of the presence of the Portuguese at Goa and the fact that they had already established themselves along with the Dutch. And the problem which is central is that all these companies were interested in buying the same thing. They were looking for cotton and silk, they were looking for pepper, clove and cardamom, they were looking for the same exact thing, and this was pushing the prices higher and higher. And therefore there was a need to have a certain advantage over at least the British inter country rivalry, and therein lies the importance of the charter. Because prices were going up, and the last thing which the English wanted was two British companies actually competing for the same thing, they eliminated that by bringing in the charter. So please do understand one thing, charter and monopoly are basically used interchangeably, but there was nothing called monopoly called in the charter. The charter just said that we, the Crown of England, give you the exclusive right to trade east of Cape of Good Hope, and therefore you will be the only one who will represent the British Crown. So therefore any ship used to have two flags, which is the Union Jack, which is the flag of England, and thereafter the East India Company flag. So it just said that you exclusively represent us, but no money was transferred. It was all just a basic order, just a royal decree. This is the first point which you need to understand out of this chapter, which is why was the East India Company established? A lot of opportunity in India. Then what was the nature of the East India Company? Private joint stock company. And last but not the least, the most important concept, which is the idea that why was there a need for the charter and how did the charter help? It helped because it did not allow other actors from England to enter into the Indian Ocean and cut the margins of the East India Company. This is the first part of the discussion. This is the first section, bringing in two chapters from 12th and 8th together. Thereafter, the second concept is based on the Shah Shuja Farman. However, I can't talk about Shah Shuja without telling you about 2 to 3 things. First, that 1613 and 1615 were 2 farmans which were given by Jahangir to the British after the British were able to show that they were a good you can say alternative or a good sport against the Portuguese, which is that if the Portuguese are going to act over smart in the Arabian Sea, they showed by basically fighting at 2 points near Diu and near Basin that we can be an alternative to the Portuguese, and Jahangir was extremely impressed, and Jahangir gave 1613 and 1615 Farman. This gave them access to Surat, the first factory of the British, and 1615 is important because through this Agra, Broch, Mauchlypatnam and Ahmedabad, the whole of the Gujarat sector and even presence in Bengal was allowed by Jahangir's Farman. Then the British follow a very strategic policy of appeasement. First get what is called as the Golden Farman of 1632, through which Golconda, just for 500 pagodas, they could trade for free. They increased the volume multifold, but the money remained the same. This is the concept of duty-free trade at a annual cost, which is 500 pagodas for Golconda. So they pay this amount and they trade any volume, and the rulers have a myopic vision. They are too short-sighted to understand that the British are misusing this in that regard. Then comes the 1639 Chandragiri concession, through which they will get Madras. They will move out of Mauchlypatnam and create Madras as a very important center on the east coast. Then they will have what is called as a 1615 Farman. This is the 1651 Farman. This is the most important Farman. I have already done this under the timelines video, but 1651 is important because it was called Shah Shuja Farman. The 1651 Farman Shah Shuja is basically based on the concept of the Golconda Farman, which is for 3000 rupees you can trade in Bengal for free, and Bengal was 60% of all the trade of the East India Company at this point of time, and therefore with 3000 rupees they were trading multifold and the volume was made 100x. Whatever was at the point of giving 3000 rupees had now become 100x, and now basically this is a loss of revenue to the Bengal state, to the Bengal governor. Thereafter, they have also further concessions in 1661, 1668. 1661 is the marriage of Catherine Braganza, through which they will get Bombay, the crown will get Bombay, and Bombay will be transferred to the British in 1668 for £10 monthly salary, monthly rent in that regard. And last major is 1717, which is called the Farrukhsiyar Farman, the Magna Carta of the British in India, which basically sold off the whole of Indian subcontinent to the British. Dastak, the concept of Surat for 10,000 rupees, 3,000 reinstated, 500 pagodas for this whole sector. Madras again reinstated, they could mint their own coins. But in between this, there was also conflict between 1690 and 1689, when Aurangzeb did realize that the British were misusing, and thereafter he will seize all the British establishments, and then on the payment of 1.5 lakh rupees to Aurangzeb, Aurangzeb will return back everything, and that will be reinstated by him, Aurangzeb, in 1690, and in 1770 by Farrukhsiyar. So these are basically all the concessions considered very important for the establishment of the British in India. But out of this, the NCERT specifically talks about the 1651. because this is considered as a foothold into the Bengal sector, and Aurangzeb's Farman and thereafter Farrukhsiyar Farman is going to reinstate it. But the idea was very simple, that there was misuse. Misuse because not just the company used to trade duty free, their officers also used to do private trading, and therefore it was a main channel of loss of revenue for the Bengal administration. Bengal was bleeding revenue because of the fact that there was misuse of both the concept of Dastak of 1651 and the what we call as the Farman of 1651, and then using it as a form of transferring it to others through the Dastak concept itself. And the idea is very simple. Aurangzeb did realize it, but the point was that it was already too late, because he was in a fiscal crisis. 1.5 lakh rupees was a very big amount. That was, this is how Bengal is bleeding. Now, the NCERT now shifts away from this concept and gives us a new section. The new section is how trade led to battles. Now, in order to understand this subsection, you had to understand this idea, which is misuse of the Farman in all sectors, be it the Chandragiri sector, be it the Golden Farman sector, or be it in Golconda, or be it in Bengal. They have increased the volume so much that everybody is losing revenue. Now, the story of Bengal specifically, on which this whole chapter is based on in the initial part, is on basically the misuse of Farman was something which Shah Shuja also noted, Aurangzeb also noted, Farrukhsiyar also noted, but they did not act upon. However, the rulers of Bengal, once they came out of the Mughal fold, which is the successor state of Bengal, therein Ali Vardi Khan and his successor Siraj-ud-Daulah did not like the way the whole Bengal administration was losing a lot of revenue. And therefore, the misuse of Farman was something which was already an eyesore in the eyes of the Bengal administration, and they wanted to do something about that. But the problem will not come through the Farman, but will come from fortifications. So the trade will lead to battle because of the English and the French rivalry in Bengal. So in Bengal, as we already know, that the English and the French were already fighting in the Carnatic sector. There was already the Austrian War of Succession which had happened, and the issue of who will come to power in Austria was in a way also what we call as embroidered or got entangled with the things which were happening in India. And the 7 Years' War was the same issue again, but this time the English and the French did not want to have the same response as they had when the first Carnatic War happened. And therefore what happened is that the British and the French started to fortify their settlements, and when they started to fortify the settlements, Siraj-ud-Daulah, already irritated by the British, will ask British and French to stop fortifications, knowing that they were doing it because they knew that there was a chance that they would fight in Bengal, because they had already done that in Carnatic, and in the third Carnatic War it is again going to happen. But they did not want it to spill it over in Bengal, but the idea was Bengal was something which was going to happen for sure. So they started to do fortifications. Now Siraj-ud-Daulah is going to ask both of them to stop. The French are going to stop, but the English won't. And this in turn will lead to Siraj-ud-Daulah to move from Murshidabad to Calcutta, capture everything, and this will lead to the concept of black hole incident. The black hole incident is when he is going to take everything away from the English. Not everybody was able to leave the port city itself, and therefore a certain number of people, we don't know exactly, 500, 1000, all numbers quoted by the English only, most probably exaggerated, were kept in a small dungeon within the Fort William itself. Here they will suffocate to death. This will be called the black hole tragedy, not a tragedy for us, an incident that was. And black hole incident will in turn lead to a justification for the East India Company to now respond by force. And therein Clive will be sent to Bengal and the treat at the city of Alinagar. Siraj-ud-Daulah and Clive will fight. Clive will win this battle. Treaty of Alinagar will be signed. However, the point was that though he had an upper hand at this point of time, Siraj-ud-Daulah was still alive, and therefore he needed to end this issue properly. So how did he end this issue properly? And that is the conspiracy of Battle of Plassey. Plassey is not a proper battle, it is a conspiracy. Here Mir Jafar, Rai Durlab, along with Ghasiti Begum and Mir Khadim, what will happen is that all of them will go into an understanding under the brokerage of Jagat Seth, Omi Chand and Amir Chand, and under that Clive will be given an idea. Clive will be given an idea that you entice the administration or Siraj to come to battle, and Mir Jafar, who was the commander-in-chief, who had the biggest army that ways, would not fight the battle, along with Qadim Khan, who was again the second largest contingent under him. So Qadim Khan was not going to fight, and Mir Jafar was not going to fight, and Sirajuddaula was going to go and fight on the behalf of the Bengal administration, and Clive would just wait for them not to fight. And this is what is going to happen in the conspiracy of Plassey, which was brokered by these merchants and bankers who wanted the dastak from the British. Plassey will actually be just a conspiracy in which Sirajuddaula will be killed by Miran, who was the son of Mir Jafar. Now Mir Jafar will come to power, he will be made the Nawab, and there will be what we call as the loot of Bengal. Clive will amass a lot of wealth, and there are two excerpts which tell us the level of wealth and the level of anger. First is, the first excerpt source tells us what is the complaint of the Nawabs which was developing in the 1730s. And herein there is a very interesting portion which says that initially when they came to the country, the British came to the country, they used to petition, they used to meet us in a humble manner, used to purchase spots, used to be very, very appeasing. Now they are enticing several merchants to come and stay within Fort William itself. They are now amassing a lot of wealth, a lot of revenue, on which they are not giving any form of taxes. And therefore, what the basic anger was, the loss of revenue. Loss of revenue will lead to the misuse of Farman, which was the main problem. Black Hole incident, Battle of Plassey, Mir Jafar conspiring against Sirajuddaula, and Sirajuddaula is killed. And thereafter the loot. Now the loot in that regard is very well captured by what Clive said himself in a very interesting correspondence between him and the Principal Secretary of the State of the English monarch. He said that, but so large a sovereignty may possibly be an object too excessive for a mercantile company. So he knew that if we take the full control of this sector, it is going to be too big for a mercantile company. So it's an object too big to take sovereignty. I flatter myself that there will be little or no difficulty in obtaining the absolute possession of such rich kingdoms. Now I leave you to judge whether an income yearly of 2 million sterlings with the possessions of 3 provinces be an object deserving of public attention. This is where the British already knew that Bengal was something which was as a cash cow, which could actually be a game changer for the East India Company. This is where Clive himself is telling you the level at which they could loot, and they did loot. Now comes Mir Jafar's frustration. Once Mir Jafar actually starts to get frustrated, he will call the Dutch to fight the English, which is called the Battle of Chinsura or the Battle of Bedara. The Dutch will not be able to defeat the British, and then Mir Jafar will be removed and Mir Qasim will be brought in. And Mir Qasim, already wary of the British what they were doing, will try to remove the influence in that regard. But what he will do is, he will remove one advantage which the British had, which was the concept of the duty-free trade. What he did was, he removed the duty for everybody. The British were extremely angry, and now Mir Qasim will run. Mir Jafar will be reinstated. Mir Qasim will then go to Sujauddaulah, the ruler of Awadh, who will say that let's go to Shah Alam II, who is the Mughal emperor. Shah Alam II, Sujauddaulah and Mir Qasim together, the tripartite, will battle it out at the Battle of Buxar. And with the Battle of Buxar, where Clive is going to win, Qasim is going to run away, the Treaty of Allahabad will be signed. And through the Treaty of Allahabad, something very dangerous was given to the British, which is the Diwani rights. And the Diwani rights is very, very important, because that makes a mercantile company into a territorial power, from trader to a ruler, and therein the vast wealth of Bengal, Bihar, Orissa was now in front of Clive, and he is going to exploit it anyway and make it a very big issue for the Bengal countryside. But what is more important is, what is the implication of the concept of Diwani? This is something which people don't talk about or don't know, which is Diwani basically allowed the triangular trade to start, which is previously the English used to bring a lot of gold and silver to India, buy everything, take it back. Again same thing, take a lot of gold and silver to China, buy everything and take it back. Perishable items, used up, bleeding gold. Now what they could do was, they could just take the money out of Bengal, buy whatever they wanted to buy and send it to England, and then convert it into opium, via which they were drugging the Chinese itself. They will drug the Chinese, take their gold, buy silk and tea and take everything to England. Now there's no outflow of gold and silver. Everything is being done within India. So now the revenues from India could finance company expenses. This is the most important point, that the British Diwani rights in India was basically making India's BOP and BOT, which is balance of payment and balance of trade, extremely negative like anything. And from India they were taking the opium to China, and from China they were taking the silk and tea, and from India they were taking commodities. And now England is having a balance of payment which is extremely positive, and they are now basically sitting on the most important revenue in India. This is the implication, and this is the first part of the chapter, the longer part of the chapter, when they're discussing Plassey, Buxar, Treaty of Allahabad and the advent of the Portuguese and the basic understanding initially. Thereafter, the idea that Robert Clive himself became such a big what we call as Nawab himself has been actually given in a very interesting section in the NCERT, which is that when he came to India, he had nothing. At the age of 18, 1743, he had nothing. And when he left India, he had a wealth of close to 4 lakh pounds, which is something which is considered to be a very big amount. Over and above that, he was given the concept of removing corruption from Bengal, but he was the principal source of that. He will also have an inquiry in the British Parliament when the British East India Company is going to be bankrupt, and at the same point in time have a lot of money because of Clive's mismanagement, and he will later commit suicide, fitting for a person like Robert Clive. But the idea was he was the one who got a lot of wealth. His family was able to amass a lot of wealth. This is all to show through the NCERT the implications of something like this. The implication that Clive and the British were able to gain so much from the Indian subcontinent that they will make sure that their rivalry with France is going to end with only them on top. Now, the chapter thereafter talks about, in very brief sense, Mysore and the Maratha, but in very brief sense. I'll try to give you more details that way. It talks about Mysore under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, the only rulers at this point of time who actually understood what the British were trying to do. That is why they went into an alliance with the French. And you have here 1, 2, 3 and 4 what we call as Mysore wars, 2 with Hyder Ali, 2 with Tipu Sultan. First 2 were just about checking each other's position. Third is the one through the Treaty of Seringapatam, that Tipu Sultan will lose everything. And fourth is when they will annex Mysore. The problem with Mysore was that the British were able to get a lot of alliance partners from the Marathas, from the Carnatic to Hyderabad to Travancore. Everybody was actually not understanding in this sector that the Mysorean sector was not the problem, it was the British. It was the British who were the problem, and therefore it is again the short-sighted disunity of India which in turn led to, and the fact that they had already, the Tipu Sultan sector had already disallowed the company from trading with them. This is where the company used their strategic partnership in this sector to actually amass a lot of wealth and also defeat the Mysorean sector. At the same point of time, the Marathas was a different story altogether. The Marathas were the mighty Marathas, the most important. Balaji Vishwanath had revived the empire with Balaji Vishwanath, Baji Rao, and thereafter Balaji Baji Rao, everything was fine. But this is where Balaji Baji Rao's understanding with the Mughals in 1751-52, which is that we will protect from any external danger, will in turn lead to the Marathas getting what we call as sucked into the politics of Abdali, and thereafter in the third battle of Panipat against Abdali, the Marathas will lose everything from Vishwas Rao to Sadashiva Rao Bhau, and there in turn will lead to a lot of uncertainty within that. Once Balaji Baji Rao is going to get to know his son is dead, he will also die, and then will come the politics of Raghunath Rao and the Madhav Rao controversy. It is Raghunath Rao who basically sold off the Marathas to the British to the Treaty of Surat once he was removed by Nana Fadnavis and the Bharbai conspiracy, and thereafter Raghunath Rao will again be removed. There will be an understanding with which, through the Treaty of Salbai, Nana Fadnavis will go into an understanding with the British. We will not go for mutual aggression, which is going to be used against the Mysorean sector also. But the second battle or the second Maratha war is the main one, in which as soon as Bajirao II, the son of Raghunath Rao, will come to power, there will be a conflict between the Holkars, Sindhyas, and the what we call as Peshwas in that regard. And Sindhyas will go with the Peshwas. On the other hand, Holkars will say we don't want to support the son of Raghunath Rao, wherein there will be the concept of the you can call it a battle of succession, but Yashwantrao Holkar is going to win over the alliance. And now Bajirao II is going to do something what his father had done, go to the British Treaty of Basin, and through the Treaty of Basin, everything was sold off, wherein a subsidiary alliance was signed. And therein, after that, even when the Marathas will try to take back this sector to the third war itself, nothing really was going to happen. Everybody was too weak. And that allows us, in that regard, to go into the next section, which is after understanding Marathas, Raghunath Rao politics, Treaty of Basin, and Mysore, Tipu Sultan, and Treaty of Seringapatam, which is the concept of doctrine of lapse and subsidiary alliance. Why is Treaty of Basin considered so important? Because the subsidiary alliance is something which destroys a native state, which is under subsidiary alliance, the concept is the British are offering a certain service, which is if a ruler takes subsidiary alliance with the British, now what happens is that he has to disband his own army, he has to keep a British resident in his court who will take calls on foreign policy and defense policy. He will now have to maintain a army which is British, the most modern, but he has to maintain everything about that army itself. No foreign policy and defense policy decision can be taken by the ruler, and any other European power needs to be removed. So what the British were doing at the same point of time were having a very big army but at not their expense. And this basically takes away the sovereignty of the king because he can't take decisions. Now, the most dangerous position in provision in the subsidiary alliance was that if you are not able to maintain this army, you will have to pay a penalty by giving your territory back. So by giving your territory back, basically the concept was subsidiary alliance was a disastrous thing which the Marathas went into, and over and above that, the concept of subsidiary alliance would only create more and more issues for the local rulers. Now, because this penalty was perpetual, it would take away everything slowly. That in turn meant that the ruler was going to lose this territory eventually. If they did not lose it, they brought in the concept of doctrine of lapse. The concept of doctrine of lapse was something which is that if you can't use subsidiary, use doctrine, which is if you don't have a naturally born son, your territory will be taken away. And therefore, doctrine of lapse was very effectively used in Satara, in Sambhalpur, Udaipur, even Nagpur and Jhansi, and that will in turn be one of the reasons for the 1857 revolt also, wherein the adopted sons will not be allowed to accede to the father's throne. And this is where even James Mill, a very interesting personality and philosopher at that point of time, along with a utilitarian, he argued that the whole absurdity of this model was that you are having perfect subservience, injunctions, you are passing everything, the resident is doing anything and everything, and the subsidiary alliance is something which is eating away. It's like a termite, it eats away on your what we call as territory in that regard. So the fact that you're getting a modern army is basically going to take away your sovereignty because you're losing if you can't pay, and if you can pay, you still can't take policy decisions. And therefore, what this chapter ends on is by showing a map of how India changed. The yellow part, which is the slow but sure expansion of the British into the Indian subcontinent, from Bengal to the Carnatic sector, which was already there, to the Mysorean sector, to the concept of Marathas, and surely but slowly through direct conquest in the case of Carnatic, Sikh, the Bengal sector, the Mysorean sector and Marathas, and indirectly through subsidiary alliance and doctrine of lapse, the British were able to expand. Now, this is basically the chapter. It's not very detailed. I have to give you a lot of context for a lot of things, but a question in the end gives you a very interesting way to practice how the NCERTs are giving you information and how you can practice a mains question. For example, what attracted European trading companies to India? That has been given in that excerpt. You can use it to answer. This can be a 15 marker, it can be a 150 word or 250 word answer. This is a very good question, but fundamental. See, NCERTs are good for fundamentals. This will give you the base to write whatever you want to write further after you read a standard book. Thereafter, what were the areas of conflict between the Bengal Nawabs and British East India Company? This is again an interesting question. Talks to you about the points of discussion, points of Farman and the concept of how the conflicts spill over into Plassey and Buxar. So in the end, what I want to argue is that through this series, this is what we are going to do. There's going to be some information in history specifically. There will be some information which the chapter is going to give. There's some information which is needed for backstory. So through this, what I want to do is I want to revise with you and also make you learn a lot of things. So I've given you certain dates which are not there in the NCERT, the 16, 13, 15 one, that you learn, you revise the understandings and try to create a theoretical understanding of this topic. So this was to basically create a certain headway, a certain headroom for you to understand how we are going to operate with regards to history. So with this, I would like to end the session. Thank you so much. I will see you soon with the next session.